Hello, this is Paul Bergin from the Mars Hill blog, which you can find at www.paulbergin.blogspot.co.uk. In continuing a series of vlogs of political heroes of mine who I think helped change society for the better. And today I'm going to be talking about Roy Jenkins, who was Labour Home Secretary, first of all from 1965 to 67, and then from 74 to 76, and then he was Chancellor of the Exchequer from 67 to 70, Deputy Leader of the Labour Party from 1970 to 72, co-founded the SDP and was leader of the SDP from 82 to 83. And he was born in 1920 in Wales. His father was a trade union official, was a miner, and later a Labour MP and at least PPS. Roy Jenkins himself went to Oxford, where he made lifelong friendships with Tony Crosland and Ted Heath, and sort of an abrasive but non-brutal. When I say non-brutal, they weren't enemies, but it was an abrasive relationship. Dennis Healy. Jenkins and Crosland were, according to Jenkins' official biographer, initially lovers, but then became close friends, and then sort of had a fractured friendship in the 60s over political rivalry. During the war, Jenkins worked for British intelligence. He worked at Bletchley Park, and after the war he was I think worked for a bank, and then he was Labour MP for Southwark from 48 to 50, and the constituency is about to go change under boundary law, so he was then MP for Birmingham Stetchford from 1950 to 76. Initially he was just known as he was for a number of years a backbench MP who wrote articles, who was also a journalist and also a biographer. He wrote a biography of Attlee during that time in the Vasquith. He was an acolyte of Gaitskill's, like a number of others, and he was considered briefly giving up politics when Gaitskill died in 63, but he did flourish under Howard Wilson. He didn't get on with Wilson for a certain period of time. They sort of had a love-hate relationship, although Jenkins did appreciate Wilson's abilities in a number of ways, and when Wilson was stricken with Alzheimer's, he was practically the only one of his former cabinet colleagues that made a point of visiting him on a fairly regular basis. When Wilson became Prime Minister in 64, Jenkins was Minister for Aviation, but then moved into the cabinet in the prestigious post of Home Secretary in 65, and he helped bring in a raft of reforms. There was the abortion law, but homosexuality was also legalised. But I think what Jenkins primarily did in that first period in the Home Office was basically made sure that the social laws and the moral laws weren't so much stamped or enforced against. And I think that's a distinction that needs to be made. What Jenkins brought in was bringing in freedoms and freedom of opportunity. He wasn't so much rebelling against morality, which is what his detractors may say. He was giving a freedom and opportunity to allow people to grow and develop as civilised human beings, but also to make mistakes, and that's important in any free and liberal, humane society. And there's a lot one can go into that, and this is not the time place. These are brief political biographies, but that's the long and short of it. But what is quite unsung about with Jenkins was I think one of his finest hours when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. The pound was devalued. It should have been devalued earlier. Callaghan resigned, but Wilson kept him in the cabinet, made him and Jenkins switch jobs. And over the 2.5 years Jenkins was Chancellor, he cut back on spending. He allowed slow but stable growth. And by 1970, the economy was in a good place. But then there were a number of good balance of trade figures, but the week before the general election, 3 days before general election 1970, the first bad ones in months, and that was enough to, I think, not on its own, but given everything else, that was enough to scare people into voting Conservative. I do wonder if the election had been called for 11th of June, whether things would have been different. Not much different, but I think it would have been fairly successful. One of the casualties in that election was George Brown, who lost his seat, and he was the deputy leader of the party, so there was a vacancy. Jenkins took it, and he was Shadow Chancellor as well as deputy leader of the opposition of the Labour Party. Europe then reared its head. Heath decided to bring Britain into membership of the EC, many in the Labour Party against it. Jenkins was one of those for it, and he saw this as an important, valuable moral standing. He didn't want to say what he regards one of the big Commons votes this century to his grandchildren, to others, that he abstained. He led 68 other Labour MPs into rebelling the whip and voting for the government. This made him a lot of enemies, and yet he held on to his principle. 5 months later, when Benn's proposal for a referendum got widespread support in the NEC and the party, Jenkins resigned from his post as deputy leader and from the shadow cabinet. He did come back under the elections to shadow cabinet the following year, but I think his position had been somewhat devalued. And whilst as Home Secretary from 74 to 76, he was perhaps not as brilliant and not so happy in the job. It did allow him a sort of semi-detachment that Wilson said would be the case. And in the 1975 referendum, Jenkins pushed for Britain remaining in the EC, and that vote was carried 2-1. Wilson resigned in early 76. Jenkins stood for the leadership, but his time had really gone. He only got 56 votes on the first ballot, and he withdrew because Callaghan and Foote was two of the other candidates were some distance ahead. Jenkins was just not good at reaching out to others. He was not really a beer and sandwiches man in reaching out to others. He was not very good at standing up for his friends when it came to negotiating from a difficult position. And I think he just had no fight in him left. And the prospect of being president of the EC came up. He took it and quit British politics. But he was not happy with the way the Labour Party was going and lurching to the left and everything else. And I think this was where Jenkins made a serious error in some respects. I think his concerns were justified. I think his sense of anger was justified. I think his remedy was not. And I say this as someone who feels that the Labour Party, as it is at the moment, is in a far worse place than it was in the late 70s and early 80s. And Jenkins, when he came back, he helped set up the SDP, the Social Democratic Party, with 3 other senior Labour colleagues, Shirley Williams, Bill Rogers and David Owen. And basically, initially they did extremely well. They went into an alliance with the Liberals. At one stage they had 50%, things could have gone well. But Jenkins, the first leader, was not a tough enough leader. He did not take the lead on issues like the Falklands War. He was not really... He was an Edwardian leading politician in the late 20th century, in the 1980s. That was not a good time. And in the 83 landslide defeat, which was as punishing for the SDP as it was for Labour, because the SDP and the Liberals, to thrive, needed to work under proportional representation, which wasn't going to happen for a while, Jenkins' leadership was over. He kept his seat till 87 when he was defeated by George Galloway, but he then got a seat in the Lords, was leader of the merged SDP Liberals, the Liberal Democrats, in the House of Lords until after the 1997 general election. He became Chancellor of Oxford University and started writing his acclaimed biographies again, including brilliant works on Truman, Harry Truman, Stanley Baldwin, William Gladstone, and Sir Winston Churchill, amongst others. In many ways, Jenkins was charming, clever, witty, a brilliant writer, a brilliant Chancellor of the Exchequer. I think he was the best Chancellor of the Exchequer we had since the Second World War. A reforming Home Secretary who took on the issues that were needed to be addressed at the time. But where I do think he failed was he was pretty much picking up his bat and ball and going home when things went against him. And I think that was one of his failings. His failings to reach out to others, amongst other things. But that should not detract from his successes. And I think his reputation as a snob is not really all that justified, although I think he was too socially insular in some ways. But whatever political failings he had should not detract from his successes. And I think Jenkins helped keep the economy on an even keel, and he helped make us, whether we're a more civilised society or not, because I don't think society at the moment is civilised, but he certainly made us a more open, tolerant society, and a society where people did not feel they were living under a cosh. And I think that is what made where Jenkins helped make society for the better. And he also defended centrist politics to the hilt, even if he went totally the wrong way about it. And that's why he is a political hero of mine. Thank you.